Hi Otters, and welcome to another guided reading lesson. Today we're going to be reading a poem, so it's slightly different, called My Shadow. It's a very short poem, so please pause me here whilst you read through it and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, so now you've read through that, I really like the rhythm and the rhymes that are in this poem, so I hope you were able to spot some of them and were able to read it to the rhythm that the author intended it. There are no quick start questions today because it's such a short poem. There aren't many quick start questions that I can do for this one. So instead, we're going to move straight on to the vocabulary check. So there are a couple of words in here that we might not be too sure of. And I thought that one was nursey, and it basically means a nurse or a nanny who cares for children. And I think nursey is more like a bit like a nickname to describe those people. You've then got notion, which means an idea. So he hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play, which means he doesn't have an idea of how they should play. And then ought to is another way of saying should do. So it's he hasn't got an idea of how children should play, basically. Coward is a person who has no courage, so they're a bit of a scaredy cat. And arrant, it means to complete or to utter. Okay. Like an arrant sleepyhead, which is in the last verse. Then you've also got a buttercup, and that's a flower, and there's a lovely picture here. You probably know what a buttercup is because it's the best way to check if somebody likes butter, if you shine it under their chin. Moving on then. So first question is, what do you think the poem is about? And whose point of view is the poem written from? So it's a two-part question. What do you think the poem is about? And whose point of view is the poem written from? Pause me whilst you have a go at this one and press play when you're ready to go through some answers, please. Okay then, so I would have written that we don't actually know the name of the person whose point of view it's written from, but what we do know, it gives us some clues, and we know that it's written from the point of view of a child. Okay, I'm going to assume a boy because it says he talks about his shadow. Okay, it describes his shadow as a he, so I'm assuming they're the same gender. Okay, so the poem is about a shadow and it's written from a child's point of view. You might have said a boy or a young boy's point of view, and I'll give you the mark for that as well. Next question. Just so you know, it says a rhyming couplet is two lines of poetry which rhyme. So they rhyme at the end of the lines generally. Now I'm wondering if you can count how many rhyming couplets there are in the poem. So I'm going to read you an example of one, so listen carefully, and then you're going to find your own rhyming couplets. So the first one in the poem says, I have a little shadow that goes in and out with me, and what can be the use of him is more than I can see. So we've got me and see rhyming. So that was one rhyming couplet. So I might circle them and put a number 1 next to it. And then you're going to work your way through the poem and count how many there are. Pause me whilst you do this, please. Because it's a couplet, it says it's 2 lines of poetry. So if you think you found a couplet, but it has 3 lines of poetry, that's going to be incorrect. Okay, so pause me whilst you have a go at this one and press play when you're ready to go through the answer. Okay then, so because I gave the first one to you, you hopefully spotted that there were 8 rhyming couplets in the poem, and there are 2 in each verse. So in the first verse, the first rhyming couplet ended in me and see. The second one is head and bed. Then hopefully you spotted the pattern, so you've got grow and slow, ball and all, play and way, see and me, up and buttercup, sleepy head and bed. So there are 2 in each verse, and there are 4 verses altogether, so that's 8 rhyming couplets. Next question, so it says, the poet tells us that the shadow is a coward. What does the shadow do that makes the boy think he is a coward? I know that the key word here is coward, and they're in quotation marks, which means it says it somewhere in the text. Can you find coward and underline it for me, please? Pause me whilst you do this. Find coward. So hopefully you found it was in that third verse, the one that starts with, he hasn't got a notion of how children ought to play. Can you read through that verse and work out why or what the shadow does that makes him a coward? Pause me whilst you find this and press play when you're ready to move on. Okay, so hopefully you've had a look through the verse 3, and it says that the shadow sticks to the poet at all times, and the poet would be ashamed to stick to his nursey this way. Okay, so he stays so close beside me, he's a coward, you can see. I'd think shame to stick to nursey as that shadow sticks to me. So something about him staying really close to the boy. Okay. Next question. Bit partner talk. So it says, look at verse 2. Can everybody find verse 2? Because in poems we don't have paragraphs, we have verses instead. It's the one that starts, the funniest thing about him is the way he likes to grow. Can you explain why his shadow does not grow like a normal child grows? Why does his shadow not grow like a normal child grows? Pause me whilst you have a go at this one, please, and then press play when you're ready to move on. Okay then, so you had to use some of your scientific knowledge for this and your knowledge of shadows. So if you don't know much about light and shadows, you might have found this question quite challenging. So, the reason that the shadow does not grow like normal children is because the size of the shadow or the height of the shadow depends on where the sun is coming from. And at different times of day, the shadow will be different lengths. Okay, and you could always test this if you fancy a little mini science experiment later. You could put an object out in your garden maybe and have a look where the shadow is. Maybe if you've got a patio or a bit of chalk, you could draw around that shadow, or you could take some pictures and do a bit of a time-lapse video of how as the sun moves, you should watch the shadow change. You can maybe go out once an hour and have a look at that shadow and see how different it is. Next question then. Bit of independent thinking, and I'm just going to tell you a feature of writing that we haven't really discussed in class before, and it's called personification. Now, personification is when you give an animal or an object qualities or abilities that only a human can have. So, for example, the trees danced in the wind. Now, a tree can't really dance, only humans can dance, but we've given them those personal qualities called personification. I would like you to have a look through the text and see if you can find 2 examples of personification within the poem. We're probably looking at the shadow here because that's an object, it's not a living creature. Okay, it's not a human. What does the shadow do that makes it sound like a human? Pause me here whilst you find 2 examples and press play when you're ready to move on. So now I've had a look through the poem, and I'd give you some different I'll give you some different marks for this. So 2 things you might have had. In the first paragraph, it says how and I see him jump before me when I jump into my bed. Okay, so you see the shadow jump, and that's a human quality, that's personification. I would probably give you, if you said about how he grows, I'd probably give you that. And then I'd also give you, oh, excuse me, I'm going to cough, how he's a coward. Definitely, I think that would give them personal qualities, human qualities. And maybe how he's a bit of a sleepyhead, he's a bit lazy and likes to stay in bed. They're the ones that I found. You might have found some others that I might give you the mark for, maybe half a mark. So please send them in to me so I can have a look. But they were probably the first couple of examples that I would have chosen. The most obvious examples anyway. And then I think, right then, last question for today. And it's a bit of a cross-curricular question. So it says, use your scientific knowledge to explain why in the final verse the shadow had stayed at home. Okay, so what do we know about shadows and light? And what does it mean that the shadow stayed at home? Pause me whilst you have a think of this one, and then press play when you're ready to go through the answer. Okay then, now this could have been quite challenging because you either do or you don't know about shadows and about light. Okay, but hopefully there was an adult or a sibling at home to help you if you weren't quite sure. Now, the reason that the shadow had stayed at home, oh, I just lost my mouse. There we go. So it says, one morning very early before the sun was up. Okay, that was what in the last verse. The narrator, the boy, the child, couldn't see their shadow because it was still dark, leading them to believe that the lazy shadow had stayed in bed. Okay, you might have said that there was no shadow because there was no sun to create the shadow because it's still dark. Something along those lines, or there was no light to make a shadow. All right then. That's it for me today. Thank you for all your hard work. I hope you like this poem. We haven't done much poetry well, in guided reading anyway. So hopefully you enjoyed that. And I will see, well, I think this will be our last guided reading session before half term. So I hope you have a lovely break and I will hopefully see you again soon. Bye.